questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The government is causing the cost of living to rise, and the inflationary deficit has doubled the national debt, and according to the PBO yesterday, it has doubled the interest rates Canadians will have to pay on the national debt. That's more than we're spending on the military. And the solution for the Liberals is to increase taxes on seniors and workers. Will the government control its spending in order to deal with the deficit and the inflationary taxes on Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as usual, the Conservatives don't appear to want to see the facts. The facts are that so far, the federal government has been posting a surplus of $6.3 billion. And the forecast is that Canada will have the lowest deficit of the G7. We will have the lowest GDP, debt to GDP ratio, and this should continue this year. The Leader of the Opposition.
More debt than all previous Canadian prime ministers combined. Doubled the national debt. Those inflationary deficits have bid up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest we pay. And now, according to the parliamentary budget officer, we will have to pay twice as much for interest on that national debt, $46 billion, more than the cost of the entire Canadian military. Liberal solution? Higher taxes on paychecks, gas, groceries, and other expenses. Why won't the government cap spending, cut waste, so that it can cancel its inflationary deficits and taxes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as usual, the Conservatives aren't bothering to even acquaint themselves with the facts. Had they bothered to read the latest fiscal monitor, they would know that so far this fiscal year, the federal government is actually running a surplus of $6.3 billion. The IMF forecasts that Canada will have the lowest deficit in the G7 this year. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7 this year, and our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed earlier this year. We believe in fiscal responsibility, and that's what we're demonstrating.
Canadians must spend on national debt interest, and they're tripling the carbon tax. Tripling that tax on gas, heat, groceries, and basically every good that has to be transported from one place to another. Now at a time with 40-year highs in inflation, Liberals want to raise those taxes even further. Our young people who are going to school are living in homeless shelters because they cannot afford the cost of living. Will this government cancel this heartless tax increase?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, for middle-class Canadians, we have cut taxes and made them better off. Today, a single parent in Ontario with 2 kids under 6 and earning $60,000 a year pays nearly $5,600 less in taxes than she did under the Conservatives. And she'll receive nearly $8,900 more through reduced child care fees and the dental benefit. She will be more than $14,400 better off than she was under the Conservatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Liberals would tell Canadians they've never had it so good. They've never had it so good. Listen, this government is out of touch and Canadians are out of money. Here are the facts. The food bank use triples, hits record almost every month. Daily Bread Food Bank. GTA food banks say they're facing the highest demand in their history. Inflation is driving Ottawa Food Bank to record heights with no end in sight, and students are literally living in homeless shelters while they go to school. And the Liberals think now is the time to raise their energy costs by tripling the carbon tax. Will they cancel this heartless tax hike now?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know who's out of touch, Mr. Speaker? A Conservative leader who thinks now is a good time to slash pension savings. The reckless Conservative scheme would cost $3.8 billion a year. So that means the Conservatives are either planning to increase our deficit by $3.8 billion a year or slash the retirement income of our seniors. They need to come clean. Do they plan to slash pensions, increase the deficit, or did they just not bother to think that far ahead?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The answer is neither. Just like when we were in government, we froze CPP taxes and we protected the CPP, increasing its benefits to seniors every single year we were in office. Now, this government wants to raise taxes on those very same seniors. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, in every single province where the carbon tax applies, Canadians pay more in costs than they get back in rebates. And it is especially high in provinces like Quebec, where there is no rebate whatsoever, but will have to pay the increased cost the government is imposing. Will this government cancel this heartless tax hike today?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Talk about a centerpiece of the Conservative economic agenda. Recently, the member for Kingston and the Islands asked the Conservative leader directly if he was finally ready to flip-flop on cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. In response, the Conservative leader couldn't even bring himself to utter the words crypto or Bitcoin. Maybe that's because since he offered his reckless advice, Bitcoin has fallen by 56%. It's time for the Conservative leader to apologize to those Canadians who made the mistake of listening to him.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, I borrowed some lemons from the Governor General, so I owe her quite a bit for those lemon wedges. But what's more humanitarian, Mr. Speaker? Welcoming tens of thousands of asylum seekers in distress, knowing that the majority risk deportation when they had time to settle in Quebec, or is it better to invest $2 billion in qualified staff at the Immigration Department in requiring asylum seekers to come across a proper border crossing and reducing delays? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we believe in the strength of our asylum system and our immigration system. We work very closely with all stakeholders on the issues at our border. We always work very closely with our partners to respect our domestic and international obligations when it comes to refugee claimants. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Well, I was hoping to have a substantive answer, so I'll ask the minister something more direct. What's more economical, using existing equipment to welcome asylum seekers, or spending between $500 million and $2 billion more and hiding how much of that money is going to Liberal donors? The Liberals' true colors really come out strongly. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the thing the Canadian and Quebec economies need is labour. Especially in Quebec, there's a serious labor shortage. So the thing we need to do together for the benefit of our country is to welcome more immigrants. We need to be a society that is welcoming to newcomers. That is what our government is going to do, and I hope we'll be able to work very closely with all members here in this place.
For Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are experiencing the highest increase in food prices in 41 years. That means families are having a very difficult time buying groceries and putting food on the table. You know what else has gone up? CEO bonuses. Neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives are willing to call out greedflation, but we are. Will the government support our demand to investigate food prices?
Hear, hear. Yeah, yeah.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Speaker, Canadians know that our government is absolutely committed to ensuring that everyone in our amazing country pays their fair share. In fact, we are raising permanently the corporate income tax on the largest, most profitable banks and insurance companies by 1.5%. And we have put in place a 15% recovery dividend on the excess profits of these institutions during COVID. We've implemented a 10% luxury tax on luxury cars, planes, and yachts. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. The cost of pasta has gone up by over 32%. So it's harder and harder for families to buy their groceries. But it's no harder for CEOs of big companies to afford their groceries because they're making record profits and huge bonuses. Clearly, greedflation is contributing, the greed of CEOs is contributing to inflation. It's fueling it. Will this government heed our demand to investigate food prices? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have been and remain determined to ensure that everyone pays their fair share. And that's why we've increased corporate tax rates by 1.5% permanently on banks and insurance companies and the major accounting firms. And we've also implemented a 15% surtax on excessive profits during the pandemic. Thank you.
Hill.
Mr. Speaker, 40-year highs in just inflation, that's where we're at. Payroll taxes have gone from $3,400 to $4,100 under this government, a $700 increase. And the planned EI premium hike is yet another increase on paychecks. So when Canadians are struggling with paying their bills, the government's next move on January 1st is to raise EI premiums on their paychecks. When will they finally give Canadians a break and cancel the planned EI tax hike?
Before going to the minister, I just want to remind the honourable members that you can't do directly what you can't do indirectly. And maybe if you're saying something, maybe just insert the pause where it's supposed to be and avoid any kind of mockery that's made of our system. The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, the facts are very clear. EI premiums are lower today than when the opposition leader oversaw them. In fact, EI premiums are actually the lowest they've been in decades. And come next January, even though the premium will be increased, it'll still be 25 cents lower than in 2015 under the opposition leader. Mr. Speaker, EI benefits are also way more generous than they were under the Conservatives 10 years ago.
Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the minister knows that she is collecting more in EI premiums than she will pay to workers. And the finance minister ought to know that the EI surplus goes to their coffers to feed their out-of-control inflationary spending. The government cannot simultaneously say that they understand the pain of Canadians and raise taxes on them. So I will ask again, will they cancel the January 1st tax hikes?
The Honourable Minister for Employment.
The EI premiums are the lowest they've been in decades, and that's a direct result of our government's investment in programs for workers, Mr. Speaker. Special benefits are more generous, Mr. Speaker. The maximum insurable earnings is more generous. Mr. Speaker, workers get more now and pay less.
That's it.
Honorable.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the EI tax increase will take another $2.5 billion out of Canadians' paychecks, not to help the unemployed, but to pay for the Prime Minister's out-of-control spending and to fill their coffers. This money should stay in the pockets of Canadians to help them pay for what they need: gas, groceries, heating, housing, everything that costs more because of this Liberal government's unfair inflationary policies. We can't afford this unjust inflation anymore. Canadians have done their share since 2015. Will the government now scrap its plan to raise their taxes? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Canadians understand full well that EI premiums allow us to fund our retirements and the CPP premiums as well. In this period of uncertainty, world economic uncertainty, it's completely irresponsible for the Conservatives to suggest that our country is not putting money aside for retirees and for rainy days. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. The finance minister who's racked up the biggest budget deficit in Canadian history, more than all other previous prime ministers put together. That's the lesson she's trying to give us. She has no credibility. The cost of groceries has skyrocketed by, it's reached its highest level in 40 years. The Liberals are going to do even worse. On January 1st, they're going to raise taxes on workers' paychecks. Instead of hurting everyone, can the Liberals put just inflation on hold and scrap the tax hikes? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives had taken the trouble to read the last financial review, they would have seen that to date, in the current fiscal year, the federal government has posted a $6.3 billion surplus. We have the lowest deficit of G7 countries, and we have a AAA credit rating. The thing Canadians should be afraid of is the Conservatives' desire to cut retired people's pensions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. $2.29. That's the price of gas in Surrey. Families and workers in BC are struggling to make ends meet because of the just inflation costs of living crisis. But the Prime Minister and the NDP say they aren't paying enough. They're forcing the people of my province to pay triple in carbon taxes and take gas close to $3 a litre. Will the Prime Minister allow British Columbians to fill their tanks, put food on the table, and cancel his unaffordable carbon tax hike?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government certainly is taking action to address affordability, for example, doubling the GST tax credit. With regard to the price on pollution, the honourable member knows that where the federal system is in place, and I would tell her that it is not in place in British Columbia, rebates are issued quarterly, and most Canadian families get a direct rebate and will continue to get a direct rebate that is more than what they pay. But let's be very clear, if we want to ensure affordability on an ongoing basis with respect to climate change, we need to ensure that we have a robust climate plan to ensure we're dealing with the costs of the future. That is something that over 6 months the Leader of the Opposition has refused to talk about. Where is his climate plan?
The Honourable Member for South Surrey, White Rocks.
Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about today. We're talking about April 1st, when tripling the carbon tax will be imposed on British Columbians. They believe that Made in BC solutions don't work, so they're forcing families, workers, and businesses to pay 3 times more in carbon taxes. Conservatives will give control back to British Columbians over their paychecks, their savings, and their lives. Tomorrow, gas goes to $2.50 a litre in Vancouver. It's shattering all North American records. But that's not enough for this Prime Minister and the NDP. Cancel the tax.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe a bit of history. British Columbia was the proud implementer of the first carbon price in Canada. It was implemented by a conservative premier in British Columbia. British Columbia continues to have its own approach to carbon pricing because they know that's the most efficient way to address pricing going forward. I would just note, Mr. Speaker, that it's pretty perplexing. Every member of the opposition that is...
I'm going to ask the minister to start over so that the honourable member for South Surrey White Rock can hear the answer she did ask for. The honourable minister.
You missed all your targets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just note that it's a little bit perplexing given that every member of the opposition sitting in this House campaigned on a platform in the last campaign less than a year ago on the basis of implementing a price on pollution. So are they telling the truth to citizens then, or are they telling the truth now?
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we saw that the Minister of Public Safety didn't know the difference between an asylum seeker and a smuggler. Let's explain it to him. Asylum seekers are people who come to Canada to claim refugee status. The smugglers are the ones who take advantage of these families by taking their savings in exchange for getting them across at Roxham Road. The smugglers are criminals. Making Roxham Road permanently makes crime pay. So now the minister has figured out who's who. When is he going to start standing up for asylum seekers instead of criminal smugglers? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the work of this government on the issue of protecting refugees' rights. Refugees make lots of positive contributions to our economy in Quebec and in Canada, and that's why we need to continue to invest at the border to buy resources for CBSA, and that's why we work very closely with the Quebec government in order to protect refugees' rights and protect the integrity of our system. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, we don't get it. We don't see why he thinks Roxham Road is okay. His government is letting poor families get robbed of everything they have on them. Thanks to his government, the main way to claim refugee status in Canada in 2022 is through people smuggling. Refugees are brought to Canada by criminals and given a police welcome. Who finds that appropriate, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that the situation at Roxham Road is a challenge, and that's why we have a strategy to deal with it and to deal with the problem of people smuggling. We're investing over $40 million. We have, and we're going to add further resources to protect refugees' rights and to bring those responsible for abuse to justice, and we will continue in that manner. Thank you.
Of Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, charitable organizations are playing a key role in delivering disaster relief needed as a result of Hurricane Fiona. The Prime Minister has committed to matching dollar for dollar any donations made to the Red Cross that go to the relief effort in Western Newfoundland and the Maritimes. The Salvation Army is equally as important in providing relief. Will the Prime Minister commit to matching monetary donations to the Salvation Army also and end this double standard?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, and I want to convey my sympathies with him in terms of what his constituents are facing in Newfoundland and Labrador. Speaker, everyone is playing a very important role in providing care and services to members of communities who are affected by this storm. We have a long-standing relationship with Red Cross Society. They have a demonstrated ability to provide services at a large scale, as we're seeing right now, to help people as quickly as possible. We'll continue to work with local organizations to provide those essential services. Thank you.
Good job. The Honourable Member for Coast of Bay Central, Notre Dame.
We're well aware of the understanding that the government has with the Red Cross, and that's great. But sources have confirmed that due to storm surges from Fiona, fish harvesters on the southwest coast of Newfoundland have lost over $2.5 million worth of fishing gear and property. Their insurance policies do not have storm surge riders. Next year's fishing season is not far away. Will the Minister of Fisheries show she cares as much about fishermen as she does about dead lobsters and compensate them in a timely manner so they can prepare for the coming season?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Well, thank you for that question, and I also want to express my concern to the members' community and the fish harvesters. Mr. Speaker, I've had a chance to hear from and discuss this with provincial premiers, with fish harvesters and their representatives, with members of Parliament, and it is a very distressing situation. We are going to work collectively in partnership to do everything we can for supporting our fish harvesters going forward.
For Cumberland, Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to hear that the ministers finally used a phone to call fish harvesters. Certainly not cell service, because the cell service in Nova Scotia is substandard for a wealthy country. Cell towers are now running on generator power. Even Liberals have recognized the essential nature of this critical infrastructure for individuals and small businesses. My Premier's called for action. The minister responsible committed to fixing and maintaining this critical infrastructure 3 years ago. When will Canadians see some action and not more platitudes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with Premier Houston that the situation with cell service is entirely unacceptable. Later today, along with the Minister of Innovation, I will be meeting with the CEOs of Canada's telecommunications providers, and I will be insisting on better service for the people of Atlantic Canada and for Quebecers, and on a plan to ensure this never happens again.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I trust that the Minister of Finance will meet with Premier Houston, not Premier Rankin. 5 days, almost 120 hours have passed since many Nova Scotians have lost power due to Hurricane Fiona. Trees are still on the power lines and blocking roads, and 20% of customers are without power. The military has been requested by Premier Houston, and their presence is desperately needed. When will this Prime Minister get more troops on the ground to clear the debris and get the lights back on in Nova Scotia?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to confirm for our colleague what the Minister of National Defence said early this morning. Every request from the Government of Nova Scotia for military assistance has been responded to positively. We have said yes to all of the requests from provincial authorities for military assistance. And Mr. Speaker, the good news for my colleague is we'll continue to do exactly that over and over again until this problem is solved.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Canadians are struggling to find a place that they can afford to call home. The Liberal government is siding with wealthy investors to hurt families by treating housing as a stock market. They're letting corporate landlords kick tenants out so that they can jack up their rent to turn a bigger profit. The financialization of housing is also pricing young people out of the market, shattering their dream of home ownership. This is wrong. Will the Liberals put a stop to the financialization of housing and put people before corporate greed?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, we know that speculative investments in the real estate sector are contributing to pushing home prices higher. That's why we've legislated an annual 1% tax on vacant, non-residential, non-Canadian owned properties, as well as a 2-year ban on foreign ownership of Canadian residential real estate. We've also committed to reviewing the tax treatment of real estate investment trusts, and we're launching a federal review of housing as an asset class. This is what federal leadership on financialization of housing looks like.
Member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
He didn't answer the question, Mr. Speaker. We're saying stop financialization and put people before corporate greed. Now, as the devastation unfolded for Hurricane Fiona, as people tried desperately to call 911 or contact loved ones, big telecom companies abandoned people, leaving them without cell phone service. And Liberals are letting those irresponsible companies off the hook. Nova Scotia's demanding that the government ensure telecom companies never abandon people in emergencies. Will Liberals enforce these regulations on telecom companies now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as we've heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, telecoms providers must ensure their services are working to the greatest extent possible after Hurricane Fiona. This evening, I'll be joining the Minister of Economic Development, Industry and Science and the Deputy Prime Minister to discuss with the telco providers the experience of Atlantic Canadians in losing connectivity, to review the fragilities of this vital infrastructure, and to determine how the expectations of Canadians on reliability and transparency going forward can be met.
The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, like many Canadians, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken a toll on the physical and mental health of public servants. Despite these challenges, they have faithfully served Canadians throughout the pandemic and continue to do so. What is the government doing to work with unions to strengthen healthcare support for public servants? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to thank my honourable colleague Vaughan Woodbridge for his excellent work and excellent French. Good news, Mr. Speaker. We have approved a new public service healthcare plan, a plan that improves support for members at no additional cost to the taxpayer. These are significant changes that will improve support for the 2S LGBTQI+ community and help for mental health. Mr. Speaker, we know that we can achieve great things together, and we will work with unions and retirees to reach this agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Lethbridge.
The average Canadian now spends more on taxes than they do on food, clothing, and shelter combined. An individual recently came into my office in the riding and said that she had moved into her car because she couldn't make rent. Another couple told me that they live out of their RV because they couldn't make their mortgage payment due to just inflation. These stories are far too common from coast to coast in this country. So I'm asking the government, will they finally demonstrate some compassion and stop their increases in taxes with regards to gas, groceries, and home heating today?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, here's what the Conservatives want to do. Slash pensions, slash EI, and ignore climate change. We have a better plan. And you know what? I think in their heart of hearts, the Conservatives recognize that. That's why they've done a flip-flop on the GST tax credit. So let me invite them today to concede defeat and support the rest of our plan to help Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
No, Mr. Speaker, what we want to do is stop their tax increases. The cost of living is at an all-time high. Interest rates are skyrocketing because of Liberal money printing inflation. And before this Liberal disaster, a third of Canadians were within $200 of not making ends meet. What's the Liberal response? Let's raise taxes, payroll taxes, and the carbon tax. Because taking more money from Canadians, that's really going to solve the affordability crisis. Mr. Speaker, please tell me this government will actually start helping and stop hurting Canadians and stop these tax increases.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. I'm not going to...
You know, Mr. Speaker, it is time for these Conservatives to come clean with Canadians. Their CPP proposal is an irresponsible scheme to eviscerate the pensions that all Canadians rely on. As personal finance writer Rob Carrick wrote this week, quote, Canada pension plan premiums are not a tax. The CPP is the bedrock of a Canadian retirement plan. The Conservatives want to recklessly undermine the pensions all Canadians depend on, but we won't let them.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If EI isn't in fact a tax, then maybe she wants to update the government website. More taxes mean Canadians have less money to pay for their bills. The carbon tax already increased the price of gas and groceries, which have just driven up inflation. But soon, people will have to take home less pay while trying to cover these higher costs. The Liberals try to sell that as taking care of people. Yet the Finance Minister had to admit that higher payroll tax gives the government another $2.5 billion from workers' paychecks. It's time to quit the excuses. Will this government end their planned tax hikes on Canadians' paychecks?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear on the record. When we brought forward the Canada Child Benefit, who voted against it? The Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, when we brought in the tax decrease on middle-income Canadians, who voted against it? The Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, when we brought in when we are bringing forward dental benefits, the GST rebate, housing benefits, who is planning on voting against it, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives. Let's be clear on who is supporting Canadians and who is voting against them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Barrie Springwater or Omidonti.
Mr. Speaker, just inflation is really hurting the residents of Barrie, Springwater, or Omidonti.
Just going to interrupt that one and maybe ask the member to start over. We're having a little bit of a discrepancy here on what can be used. If I can have everyone calm down. just waiting so that we can. Yeah, no, I understand. The honourable member couldn't hear me. There's some play on words that really are doing indirectly what you can't do directly. So I'm going to ask the honourable member to start over and maybe correct his error.
Mr. Speaker, just inflation. Just this week, the executive director of the Barrie Food Bank stated, everything we buy is more expensive. She also noted that people who have historically donated to the Barrie Food Bank are now using it to feed their families. The number of households who have accessed the food bank in August was up 60% compared to last year. Would the Prime Minister please acknowledge we have a serious affordability crisis and commit to cancelling the proposed EI and carbon tax increases that will only cause more pain for hardworking Canadians?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's put some numbers on the table. 450,000. 450,000 children have been lifted out of poverty since we brought forward the Canada Child Benefit. Mr. Speaker, instead of sending checks to millionaires, we're sending benefits to hardworking Canadian families who need that help. Mr. Speaker, we understand the high cost of living. We understand the high cost of raising a family. That's why we have put more money in the pockets of Canadians than Conservatives have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Avignon-la-Métis, Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, the federal government has transformed Roxham Road into a permanent border crossing. That's not us saying this, it's the RCMP. In 2020, the RCMP entered into an agreement for, and I quote, nursing services at the Roxham border crossing. That's how they've said it. Mr. Speaker, even the RCMP is now treating Roxham Road as if it were an ordinary customs post, except it is not a customs post, it's a way to get around them. Instead of creating a parallel customs system run by the police, why not simply suspend the safe third country agreement so that families can go through real customs? The Honourable Minister for Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, we have an agreement with the US to protect the rights of refugees with a process that is transparent, fair and equitable, and that offers legal consequences if people abuse the system. So we will continue to modernize the agreement with the United States of America in order to strengthen our asylum system. That is the best way for us to move forward. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Avignon-la-Métis-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, what the government calls irregular entries at the borders, well, it's supposed to be irregular. But in Quebec, 98% of the asylum seekers received by land went through Roxham Road. 98%. So there's no one going through border crossings, apparently. When we take all the provinces and all the land, sea and air entries, Roxham Road accounts for 64% of Canada's asylum seekers. Does the Minister think it is normal that under his watch a regular entry at Roxham Road has become the official and internationally recognised way to claim asylum in Canada? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, listen. Our asylum claim system must be robust and humane. There are no magical solutions. Asking to close Roxham Road or suspend the agreement will have the contrary effect, no doubt. And as we have mentioned a number of times already, Mr. Speaker, what we have to do is modernize this agreement, and that is exactly what we are doing by working with the United States of America on a more sustainable system.
The Honourable Member for Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, this government may just dismiss it as just inflation, but these are very difficult times for Canadians that they keep dismissing. People in BC are struggling to feed their families and have to make tough choices between paying for food, gas, TELUS, Hydro, and Fortis. Countless people can barely pay their rent, never mind thinking of saving for a down payment for a home. Now this government is looking to make those hard-earned dollars stretch even less, especially for low-income workers. So my question today is very simple to this government. Will they stop their planned tax hike on Canadian paychecks?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
We're providing real help to Canadian renters through the Canada Housing Benefit, which is already providing an average of $2,500 to many vulnerable renters across the country. And in recent legislation, we've introduced a top-up to that Canada Housing Benefit, a one-time payment of $500. Now, if the member from Mission, Matsqui-Fraser Canyon cared about Canadian renters, he would speak to his colleague from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, who played procedural games in this chamber to delay the passage of that real help that is going towards vulnerable renters in Canada.
The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are getting walloped by not just inflation. Even after paying more for everything because of Liberal inflation, Canadians spending more on taxes than food, clothing, and shelter combined. Yet here comes the Liberals with another tax hike come January. Now, there's no way for the Liberals to spin these tax hikes. Come January, Canadians will have less money in their pocket and smaller paychecks. So will the government commit to cancelling these damaging paychecks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk a little bit about EI. So the EI contribution rate today is $1.58. Next year, it's going to be $1.63. And guess what? Both of those rates are lower than every single year when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. So let's be clear about the Conservative schemes. They are proposing to slash our pensions. They're proposing to undermine the EI system. They are even disagreeing with things they actually did when they...
The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk facts. Hardworking families in my riding are already struggling to fill their tanks, put food on their table, and keep a roof over their head, all because of this government's overspending. This Liberal government has tripled down on the carbon tax. And the reality is that Canadians on January 1st will wake up to smaller paychecks. The last thing my constituents need is another federal assault on their hard-earned paycheck. Canadians are at a breaking point. The cupboards are bare, and this government just doesn't get it. I'm asking them to show some compassion and cancel their planned raid on Canadian paychecks. Mr. Speaker, will they do that?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely compassionate when it comes to families in this country. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I was in British Columbia on Friday making a really important childcare announcement. British Columbian families are going to save up to $6,600 a year on the cost of childcare by the end of this year. Mr. Speaker, we are there for Canadians, and what the Conservatives are talking about will hurt Canadians further. Hardworking Canadians that have saved for their pensions, that need that employment insurance in tough times. Mr. Speaker, we're going to be there for Canadians. I hope the Conservatives would.
The Honourable Member
for Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, across the country this week is Concussion Awareness Week. In 2018-2019, an estimated 46,000 children and young people were formally diagnosed with concussion by hospital emergency departments. This after being injured whilst doing physical activity. Can the Minister for Sport tell us what our government is doing to reduce these accidents as much as possible? The Honourable Minister for Sport. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague for her question and her work on behalf of her constituents. Our government is supporting national sport organisations to improve rules, improve training protocols, as well as improve behaviour in training protocols to reduce the risk of concussions. Our government has invested $46.1 million thus far, with more to come, in the fields of research and measures to improve prevention, diagnosis and treatment of brain injuries, including concussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, last week in the Justice Minister's hometown, there was a shooting outside the Bell Centre. And yesterday, a man was shot near the riding of the Public Safety Minister. In fact, violent crime in Canada has increased 32% since the Liberals took office. But instead of reducing crime, Liberals are reducing the number of violent criminals going to jail thanks to their soft-on-crime Bill C-5. We don't need less criminals in jail, we need less victims of crime. On this side of the House, Conservatives will always put the safety of Canadians first. Will the Prime Minister finally withdraw the soft-on-crime Bill C-5?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the security of Canadians is our absolute priority, and serious crimes, Mr. Speaker, will always carry with them serious consequences. I reject the premise of the honourable member's question. What we are doing with Bill C-5 is putting an end to policies from the Harper government that have failed. They have failed to make Canadians safer, and they have wasted valuable police and judicial resources on infractions that are better treated, not incarceration. What we are doing with C-5, Mr. Speaker, is being able to put more resources into serious crime, as Justice Michael Moldaver has recently said we ought to be doing.
The Honourable Member for Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, since the Liberals formed government, serious violent crime has substantially increased. Homicides alone up 30%. This is a direct result of this government's soft-on-crime agenda and lack of empathy towards victims. Now, thanks to Bill C-5, weapons trafficking, robbery with a firearm, drive-by shootings, fentanyl trafficking, kidnapping will no longer be punishable by mandatory sentences. Why does this government continue to advocate for criminals while recklessly neglecting the rights of victims?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the security of Canadians is our absolute priority. What we are doing with Bill C-5 is allowing for more resources to be spent on the very serious crimes that the honourable member is referring to. Those serious crimes, Mr. Speaker, will always carry with them serious consequences. But all that the failed Conservative tough-on-crime policies left us with was not public security, not greater public security, Mr. Speaker, but increased overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black people in our criminal justice system. We're reversing that, Mr. Speaker, by putting the resources on the serious crime where they ought to be.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the phenomenon of scoring, which involves scoring points by shooting innocent victims at random, is growing in Montreal. According to police sources, this behaviour may be behind the attack in the Rivière-des-Prairies neighbourhood, where an innocent 25-year-old woman was shot in the legs in a hail of gunfire. In response to this violence in Montreal, the Prime Minister wants to abolish minimum sentences for the crimes of illegal importation, intentional discharge and theft with a firearm. Will the Prime Minister finally admit that he is wrong with Bill C-5 and stop it in its track? The Honourable Minister for Justice. Public safety is our absolute priority. What we are doing with Bill C-5 is eliminating policies that were failures from the Harper government that bogged down the justice system and that filled our prisons with minor infractions, Mr. Speaker. These resources would be better spent on serious infractions and serious crimes. Mr. Speaker, serious crimes, serious consequences.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, part of reconciliation means continuing to support Indigenous communities across Canada. Last week, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety announced a historic agreement with the Siksika Nation in Alberta for self-administered policing services. Can the Minister of Public Safety please speak to how Indigenous policing agreements are advancing the government's commitment to reconciliation?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
I want to thank my colleague for the question and for his advocacy. Last week, I was very honored and pleased to announce for the first time in 14 years a new self-governing agreement which will bring back the Siksika Police Service. I think this is the product of work of many of my colleagues in government, and I do want to take a moment to thank Chief Ure,
I want to take a moment to thank Alberta, who has collaborated with us on this. This is a way in which we can ensure the advancement of the principles of reconciliation and empowering Indigenous communities to lead policing initiatives so that they can protect their communities as every other non-Indigenous community across the country. Thank you.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, the decisions being made right now on issues like the climate crisis and housing affordability have a tremendous bearing on the lives of young people, and they deserve a say. Now, in 2005, the current government House Leader rose in this place and said, "I think that reducing the voting age to 16 represents an incredible opportunity." Well, I agree, and he's in luck, because in a few minutes, he has a chance to vote yes and send Bill C-210, the Right to Vote at 16 Act, off to committee. My question to him, will he support, and will his government support this important bill?
The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hope it doesn't surprise you that I'm happy to speak for the government House Leader on this issue. Mr. Speaker, as you know, our government and the Prime Minister in particular have made very, very significant efforts to encourage young people to be involved in our parliamentary democracy. Our government has constantly taken steps to ensure that our democracy is open and inclusive for all people, particularly young people. Mr. Speaker, I would note that Elections Canada has also done very important work in this area. I had a very good conversation with my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley, and we look forward to working with him on this important issue in the months ahead.
The honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, according to Restaurants Canada, over the last 12 months, 43% more restaurants have closed than opened. In my riding, restaurants are paying as much as 3 times more for food and materials. Pre-pandemic, vegetable oil was only $16 for 16 liters. Today, it's $53. Mr. Speaker, with the businesses fighting to survive and with few tourists brave enough to visit a Canadian airport, what is the government's latest answer to curbing rampant inflation and soaring food prices, beyond re-announcing programs that may or may not come into existence in this decade?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for that important question. Small businesses, particularly restaurants across the country, have seen enormous support from the people in their communities throughout this pandemic, and I thank them for ordering online and for supporting them throughout a very, very tough time. We have been with them, had their back throughout this pandemic, and I want to assure this member and all small businesses and all those restaurants, just like the one I grew up in and worked in, that we've got their back and we will continue to help them through this difficult time.
That's all the time we have for question period today. I believe we have